It happens every year, really. There are free agents. We get hyped about them. There's all this attention. They sign with their new teams and they end up either, I mean, the one I'm talking about is they underperform. We can point to a lot of cases from last year. A lot of the top players didn't perform well. So who among the players the Giants are considering, or at least rumored to be considering, is most likely to regress next season, and who is most likely to overperform? We'll get to those questions and more next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspik, and on this show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts. And coming up on today's show, because we're in this weird period, right? The World Series hasn't started, the off season hasn't started, and we get a lot of mailbag questions. And so I want to just continue to run through these. So we're going to get to some more mailbag questions. Eric says, of the potential free agents that the Giants may target, who do you think is the most likely to regress, and who do you think could outperform? So yeah, I mean, it's very relevant. It's a very relevant question, Eric, because it happens every year, like I said. I mean, look at what Chris Bryant did. I know that injuries were a part of it, but injuries are often a part of it. Bryant had an injury history, and he missed almost all of last year with the Rockies. And then Nick Castellanos is a guy I like to point to as an example as well. He got 5 years, $100 million from the Phillies, and basically performed like Tommy La Stella. Like, it was a disaster for Castellanos in Philadelphia. They're in the World Series regardless, but it happens every year. And so in terms of the guys the Giants are looking at, when you say regress, like, I don't 100% know if you mean like from 2022 performance or just regress from expectations. Because Aaron Judge, he might get paid more than he otherwise would have if he just had a normal Aaron Judge season. And is he gonna be paid too much relative to what we actually should expect just because of the season that he just had, the monster, like, historical season he just had? I don't expect him to repeat that level of performance. I'd tilt more towards what is his career norm, especially given that he's going to be 31. I may even regress it a little bit and expect perhaps soon some decline is going to start to set in. If he's very good and you start to decline, it's not a problem until you've really declined. So anyway, I wouldn't expect Aaron Judge to put up another 11.5 Fangraphs wins above replacement type season. He was more of a guy who would give you 5 in a good Aaron Judge year prior to that. And so that's something to look out for, is that you may not get that elite performance if you do end up with an Aaron Judge. But just going through the other names in terms of who I think would be expected to regress, I mean, a lot of the guys I'm optimistic about. I think Dansby Swanson, I wouldn't be so thrilled about giving a huge contract to Dansby Swanson because I worry about the bat. Like, he hasn't been an impact hitter. He's been more or less an average hitter, like league average hitter for his career. And yet he could be in line for, $100+ million contract. And I would worry about if the bat kind of falls back down to earth a little bit and more in line with his career norms, you're possibly overpaying by quite a bit. Very good defender, very good runner, but I don't know what I'm getting with the bat. And then with Xander Bogaerts, he's someone like, I'm very attracted to the kind of middle road that is Xander Bogaerts, in that there are all these really good shortstops, and he's one that comes to mind for me as a nice middle road. I think that Trey Turner's going to get more money and is a flashier name. And then, like I said, there's kind of my concerns about about Dansby Swanson's bat. But Xander Bogaerts is kind of a nice combination. But when I look at the numbers, I'm a little bit concerned about the expected numbers. Like when we look at what he did this year, he had a 363 weighted on base average, which comes out to a 134 weighted runs created plus. So significantly better than average offensively in 2022 based on results. But when we look at the expected weighted on base average, just 323, 40 points below the actual weighted on base average. And he has been a guy, when I look through in his entire career, he's outperformed the expected numbers. And so is he a guy who's just really well suited for Fenway Park, where they've got this super short left field? And does he just take advantage of that? When I look at the numbers, if you take him out of Fenway Park, how does that translate? And so I would have some concerns there. Like, he only hit 15 home runs, yet he manages to be basically an elite offensive player without hitting for a ton of power. And so that would concern me a little bit if you're giving out a 100+ maybe $150 million contract to a guy like this. So those are some of my concerns about some of the upper tier players. And in terms of guys I think could overperform what they end up getting, I mean, Brandon Nimmo is another guy I have concerns about, just because he hasn't been on the field all that much. And so when we talk about regress, I think regress from a health standpoint. And that is something that, honestly, I've intended to look at this. Like, I don't know exactly what has kept Brandon Nimmo out for so many games at various times throughout his career. I need to look at that, and I will eventually. But if you look at his kind of games played by season, he's often missing huge, significant numbers of games. This year, he didn't really. He played a lot. He had 673 plate appearances this year, which was, among the leaders in terms of all these players that I'm looking at as possible targets for the Giants. But I would worry about, does the health issue come back and rear its ugly head if you sign him to a lucrative multi-year deal? But in terms of players who I think could overperform, I keep coming back to Willson Contreras, and I'm not sure the Giants will actually be interested in Willson Contreras. Like, are they committed to Joey Bart and Austin Wynns? I just think it's an area where you could really upgrade, because you don't necessarily know what you're going to get with Joey Bart. There's still the promise that he could be more than what he's been, but the Giants have the financial might to go out and sign a guy who we know is already one of the better hitting catchers in baseball. And I started to say this the other day, but then I cut myself off and never got back to it. But it's possible that not too long from now, maybe even in 2024, we could see an automated strike zone. And the biggest knock against Willson Contreras is framing. And if suddenly framing isn't as important, then he would be even more valuable. You'd also probably see a shift towards putting more, worse defensive catchers behind the plate to get better production offensively, because right now so much of their value comes from framing. If that wasn't as true, then there'll be a tilt towards offense, and maybe in that way it would diminish his value. But anyway, I just think you could totally upgrade. I think that he's not necessarily in line for a huge deal, yet he's just as reliable as they come in terms of just getting above average offense, like way above average in terms of what does the normal catcher do. And so, yeah, I mean, there aren't a ton of guys. It's not easy to predict guys who will overperform, but yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of it in terms of who I'm going to mention right now. I'm not talking about pitchers. I think I keep ignoring pitchers, and I probably should start focusing on them a little more, but I don't really have that many concerns about a lot of the top tier arms on short-term deals, because it might not work out, but they're short-term deals. And so that's kind of the point, is that if they crash and burn, like, you're not on the hook for 5-6 years, it's one and done perhaps. So yeah. Anyway, coming up in just a minute, we're going to talk about Manny's interesting idea. Should they get rid of the American League and National League distinctions altogether now that these two teams play by the same rules? And then you could kind of shuffle things up in terms of the divisions a little bit. So we'll get to that in just a second. But first, as everyone knows, athletes rise and fall in the ranks. We were just talking about it. Right now, you might be up, and in the off season, or next season, I should say, you might be down. But when it comes to saving money, Simply Safe always stays on top. And right now you can save big with Simply Safe Home Security. They're giving listeners 40% off their advanced security system. Simply Safe was just named the best home security of 2022 by US News. I use it and I love it, and I know that you'll love it too. Because at Simply Safe, your safety is the only thing that matters. For me, I haven't had an issue where I needed their advanced technology that is able to identify a threat and give you the highest priority of police response. But what I love is just simply the ease of use with the app and being able to view all of the different cameras at any time, whether I'm home or away, check in on everything that's going on around the house with crystal clear HD quality. So don't miss your chance to save big when you protect your home with the best. Get 40% off your order when you visit simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb today. Customize the perfect system for your home in just a few minutes. That's simplysafe.com/lockedonmlb. Go today. There's no safe like Simply Safe. All right, as promised, more questions and answers. The next one coming from Manny, who says, do you think MLB should get rid of the American League and National League since they play by the same rules? I would think if they do this, the divisions can change and give baseball a shakeup. For example, Pacific Division, Giants, Mariners, Dodgers, A's, Angels, Padres. So there are like intended consequences here. And I know that there's a lot of opinions out there about the pros and cons of doing something like this. But my opinion is that they should shake it up a little bit. And a lot of it for me comes down to travel. And these teams on the West specifically travel a lot more than teams in the Central and even on the East, because mostly it's because the Central and the East are both so far away for teams on the West. And the Major League schedule, I know there are pros and cons to this, but thought that it would make sense to have longer series, like 5-game series instead of 3 and 4. The con is that you're exposing two teams to each other for a long period of time, and tempers tend to flare in those cases is the theory. But in terms of getting rid of the AL and the NL, yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways that would make sense because they do play by the same rules. And now with the new CBA starting in 2023, we're seeing a far more balanced schedule where every National League team is going to play every American League team every year. And, obviously vice versa with the AL and the NL, obviously. And so we're kind of trending in that direction. They're not just going to do this now. That's the thing, is like this would be a part of a collective bargaining agreement. The next one, thankfully not for another 4 years. And then who knows if you see something like this. I think we will possibly and maybe probably see expansion and then restructuring of the divisions at some point. My big issue has always been, I think that what bothers me is that you can, for example, finish in third place in your division with 100 wins. You could have 200 and, teams with more wins than you above you. And then in some other division, you might have a division winner with 82 wins. And then that team, in the old way of doing things, had way more of a benefit than you, even though you won 20 more games, right? And so winning the division, it was like, okay, you automatically go to the division series. And if you finish in third, but you had 100 plus wins, the best you can hope for is that 1-game wild card. I thought that was insane in a lot of ways, personally. But they addressed that to an extent. Now the worst of the 3 division winners per league has to go to the wild card round, which the top 2 division winners get to skip, but everybody else has to go through. So again, it's still not really fair to me that you could finish with 100 plus wins and the team and you go to the wild card round, and then maybe you have a better record than either of the other 2 division winners, except the one you finished behind, and you have to go, you don't get to skip it. I just think, why not, like you're saying, Manny, why not just get rid of all these distinctions and even divisions and just have seeds? You just have your 30 teams and you just have your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 through 1 through 12, which is what we currently have is 12 teams. And sure, you could have the top four teams skip the first round, and then seeding based on record, like the fifth best team in Major League Baseball playing the 12th best team in Major League Baseball, and six playing 11. I just think that ultimately makes the most sense, and you lose you lose like divisional matchups, and I get that, and I do think I wouldn't want to lose the Giants-Dodgers rivalry and playing the Dodgers a lot more than you play Joe Schmo, Minnesota Twins, Kansas City Royals, right? And so I don't want to lose that, but at the same time, for me, it comes down to like fairness in terms of seeding and just having the top teams get a benefit and having the bottom teams not, and having everything in between make more sense and be more based on merit and not just based on these arbitrary divisional opponents. Like just because you're lucky to be in a division that doesn't have the Dodgers in it, and your best team is, the central divisions are pretty weak right now, and they don't spend a lot of money relative to these other divisions. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So Manny, I like where you're going with that, and yeah, I think that we should continue to think about this, and we will. And expansion is definitely going to shake things up, and the league was trying to do that, and then COVID kind of interfered. But I would imagine those conversations pick up again in the not too distant future, and ultimately may come to pass, and probably will come to pass. So the next question comes from WITGIZ. No idea how to pronounce that. Could the Giants spend money on Aaron Judge and a top-of-the-line starter in Jacob deGrom or Carlos Rodón? And then Nick says, follow-up question, would Rodón and Judge be enough? And so, as I have done multiple times this offseason, I want to point out that even with the guaranteed contracts the Giants have, plus factoring in all of their arbitration estimates, they still come out to about $100 million. And this is assuming they take the buyout on Evan Longoria. They may decide to bring him back, but I would imagine they would only add a few $1 million on top of the buyout, which is for $5 million. The club option is for $13 million. So it's just an $8 million difference. It doesn't, even if they picked it up, it doesn't move the needle all that much. So if they're at about $100 million, and in recent years they've been at about $160 million, it would give them $60-ish million to spend on 2023 salaries. So the AAV of these contracts, not an AAV meaning average annual value, not the total value. So when you talk about Judge, $300 million, I'm not saying they can add $60 million, and $300 million is much higher than $60 million, so they can't do it. I'm talking about the per year salary. So if Judge gets $35 million a year, that's what I'm talking about. So you could say Judge at $35 million a year, Carlos Rodón at $25 million a year, and that comes out to $60 million. So in looking at it that way, they absolutely could spend the money on Judge and a top of the rotation starter. Where I haven't really talked about this much, but where I get wrapped up a little bit is that Carlos Rodón may end up around $25 million a year, but I think Jacob deGrom is going to get significantly more per year because it'll probably be a much shorter term deal. So he could get Scherzer AAV, which was like $43 million per year over 3 years. deGrom might get that over 2 years, perhaps 2 or 3. But then you start to say, can you add $40+ million a year plus an Aaron Judge at $35 million a year? That's $75 million combined per year. So maybe that gets a little bit dicey, and maybe that tilts you back towards Carlos Rodón, or maybe you stop caring about staying around $160 million. So we'll wrap up that question in just a minute, and we'll talk about Tommy La Stella and his future in San Francisco in just a minute. But before we do, all right, as promised, we're going to get to some more questions in just a minute. Thanks for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. For your second listen today, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with the local experts and insights only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. So yeah, I just want to wrap up that point. It's just interesting to me that Carlos Rodón, because he's likely to get, because he's younger, right? He's only 29 or 30 years old. He's likely to get 5 years, I would imagine. That's kind of been the standard for really good starting pitchers the last several years here. Kevin Gausman, Robbie Ray coming off a Cy Young season, Joe Musgrove signing an extension right before reaching free agency. 5 years, $120 million has kind of been the standard contract for good starting pitchers around this age. So I'd imagine that Rodón ends up in that ballpark. But for Jacob deGrom, he's a different kind of story. He's been so good, so elite when he's been on the field, but he hasn't been on the field all that much, and he's older. And so I don't see him getting a 5-year contract. And when we look at, top of the rotation arms who are out there this winter, the names are Jacob deGrom, Clayton Kershaw, Justin Verlander, and Carlos Rodón. And I mean, in my opinion, there's a lot of starting pitchers out there. Those are the frontline guys, those 4. And so deGrom, Kershaw, and Verlander are all likely to get these shorter term deals. And Rodón is likely to get the 5-year deal. But shorter term for maybe similar impact comes out to more per season. And the Scherzer deal kind of changed the market because the Mets seemingly really pushed the envelope there and perhaps overpaid, certainly relative to what was normal in terms of these types of deals. Trevor Bauer also got a very big, I think, 3-year deal, but he's been suspended from Major League Baseball, so he's not being paid it. But when they signed him, it was 3 years, $100 million or so. But Scherzer got what? 3 years, $130 million, $130 million. And so anyway, if you divide, $40 million a year versus 22, is it really worth double for deGrom just because it's shorter term? Or would you rather maybe get Rodón at $22 million a year over 5 years? So that'll be a very interesting story to watch. And it depends on if they are willing to push past $160 million. Anyway, moving on. The next question comes from Atticus, who says, what's the best case scenario for trading bad contracts, i.e. La Stella? Who do you think would be a good trade partner? So the best case scenario, there aren't a lot, right? When you're talking about a negative trade asset or a liability on your roster, basically, they're being paid more than they're worth. You're not going to get anything of value per se. But what the best case scenario would be to do a favorable swap where you're getting somebody else who's maybe on a bad contract, but at a position that is more of need. I was just kind of scrolling through other teams' payrolls and, someone who popped up, it's not the best fit, but it's just an example of the type of perhaps best case scenario. Yasmani Grandal on the Chicago White Sox has 1 year remaining on his contract, and it's for $18 million. La Stella's owed $11.5 million next year. But this is why it's not a perfect fit, because the Giants have Joey Bart, and do you really want to bring in Yasmani Grandal for 1 year? That would really complicate things. And obviously, what I meant to say about Willson Contreras earlier is that if you had Willson Contreras, a catcher that you sign, it wouldn't be for 1 year. That's the thing. It would be more of a long-term solution. Joey Bart would become expendable, and perhaps you could trade him for another similarly valued player at another position that is more of a need, and maybe get somewhere where you're a little deeper, so there's not as much pressure on them to perform. But you could do the same thing, perhaps trading La Stella for Grandal, and because the White Sox had a catcher who actually performed well, and so they're paying all this money to Grandal, but he might not even be their primary catcher. And so you start thinking about bad contract for bad contract. The thing about Grandal is he had a miserable season in 2022, but before that in his career, he's been one of the better catchers in the game and one of the better offensive catchers in the game. And so something like that, where you swap him out for a position that's a little bit more of a need, or it's just providing the salary component of some kind of trade where maybe you're taking on more money. We've talked about Shohei Ohtani as a possible trade partner with for the Giants if he is available, and perhaps there's money involved in such a trade. Maybe I'm just throwing out wild ideas here, but perhaps you take on some of Anthony Rendon as part of that trade, in order to further entice, because it's kind of a not looking like a great contract for the Angels, and maybe Tommy La Stella offsets some of the money. And so just using, I hate to do it, like these are people, not just commodities here, but you use the money that he's owed to kind of offset or just swap bad contracts. But what they absolutely should not do, in my opinion, they should not just try whatever they can do to get rid of him so they don't have to pay the money. Because if you do that, you're having to give up something of value, right, to balance it out. He's a negative asset. And so you'd have to provide a positive asset to balance that out. So that they absolutely should not do that. They should just bite the bullet when it comes down to it. But the odds of La Stella being on next year's roster, certainly I think at least 50%, like in terms of it's no higher than that. And it might be significantly lower than that given their clear need and desire to get younger and more athletic. He is like the antithesis of that. So last question from Danny. Any chance the Giants upgrade the chicken tender situation? Real rough the last 2 years. So I have heard about this, Danny. I have not purchased chicken tenders at Oracle Park the last 2 years. So I don't know from firsthand experience what this looks like. Feel free to send me a picture or something or describe it. I have heard that they've gotten smaller, right? That's the issue, and they cost the same. So feel free to clue me in, but yeah, you would hope that the Giants would do a better job, because I know that people are complaining about this, and I mean, your attendance isn't great, and a lot of it has to do with the cost of the whole experience of going to a game with parking and tickets and food, and then the food you're getting isn't even perhaps very good, or is, it's getting smaller and you're paying the same or more. So yeah, hopefully they hear these complaints and improve the situation. But I have no inside knowledge as to any chance the Giants are going to upgrade the chicken tender situation. Anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. The biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. Helps me out a lot, so thanks in advance, and thanks to everyone who's done so already. I can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.